Hello, everybody in the room and everybody listening. And I want to welcome some great colleagues and friends into this space with me. And we're going to have a fruitful discussion, but also one that will confront some difficult issues we face as educators and working in a university. I want to start off by introducing the people in the room and ask them to say a little bit about themselves. I'm going to start with myself. So I am Akile Ahmet, and I am the head of inclusive education at the LSE. And I've taught at a number of different universities, Middlesex, Queen Mary, Goldsmiths, Brunel, and here. And I currently teach 2 sessions on the PG Cert that look at inclusive education and decolonising and inclusive pedagogies directly. I'm going to now hand over to Banaji, who is Professor in the Department of Media and Communications.
Hi, I'm Shakuntala Banaji. I'm Professor of Media, Culture and Social Change in the Department of Media and Communications at LSE. I've been here approximately 12 years and have been teaching for nearly 32 years now. Started off teaching 11 to 18-year-olds for quite a long time, which is where I developed all my joy in teaching, and then have been teaching in higher education for the last 20 years.
Great. And Jillian Terry, who is Associate Professor and Co-Director of LSE 100.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, thank you for having me as part of this panel. I am, as Akile said, one of the co-directors of LSE 100, which is the school's flagship interdisciplinary course that's taken by all first-year undergraduates at the LSE. I've been at the LSE now about 12 years, came here to do my PhD. I'm trained as a feminist international relations scholar and originally come from the very small island of Newfoundland on the east coast of Canada. So I have some experience of higher education in Canada and teaching there as well, but most of my higher ed teaching experience is here at the LSE.
Thanks, Jillian. And finally, and by no means least, Michael Mason, who is the Director of the Middle East Centre and also Associate Professor in the Department of Geography and the Environment.
Thank you, Jillian. Thank you for the invitation to this event. I look forward to the discussion. As you say, I'm an Associate Professor in the Department of Geography and Environment here at LSE and Director of the Middle East Centre at LSE. My research is broadly concerned with issues of environmental politics and governance. I have a long-standing interest in environmental politics and governance in areas of contested sovereignty, particularly areas under occupation. I was inspired by a geography teacher when I was very young, as to the wonders and the fantastic potential of teaching in not only in transmitting ideas but sort of empowering people to sort of really realize what they want to do in life. Within the Middle East Centre, I've been involved with a research program which has developed a curriculum, an alternative sort of decolonizing curriculum on the occupied Golan Heights, which I might mention in this discussion. If anybody's interested, then go to the Middle East Centre website and find all the documents about it there.
So we're going to be talking about inclusive pedagogies as a broad topic. And I think you sort of just mentioned just now, Michael, what influenced you to kind of go into teaching. And certainly for me, there have been key people that I've met along the way, authors that I've read that really kind of have influenced me and still influence me now. And so I thought we could start off with a really sort of open question around which authors, scholars, practitioners, students have significantly influenced your teaching practices. So over to you. Looking at Shaku first.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Akile. So who has influenced my teaching? Probably I'd have to start by saying my mum, who was briefly, I think for about 2 years, a teacher before I was born, and then gave it up to basically be a mum and a full-time political activist. And lots of my mum's and dad's friends who were all socialist activists, trade unionists back in the 70s, influenced my desire to change the world by changing how people think about the world. And I think by the time I was 4 or 5 years old, my poor younger brother, who was 2.5, was getting mini lectures from me about what he should know and how he should view the world. I'm sure if he ever listens to this, his ears will be burning. But I think I was a pedagogue from the age of around 5, and everybody who encountered me, either older or younger, kind of had that experience of me wanting to explain things to them. And I think by the time I was in primary school, and my school in India was taught in the old, not just the old banking education system, but it was incredibly disciplinarian. So we were punished physically, we were beaten, we were humiliated, and me much less so than some of the other students. And it was an incredibly hierarchical system. It was a system where class, caste, religion, and race played massive roles in how teachers got away with things, how they spoke to students. And I was burning with a sense of injustice by the time I was 10 years old, not just from having listened to socialist pedagogues outside of my classroom, but just from experiencing the everyday hostility of teachers towards students whom they were constantly constructing as the other. So in that context, I'd have to say I learned to teach from the teachers who didn't do that. And there were teachers like that, even in a big government-run school in India where we had 90 children in a class, you could still find on occasion a teacher who could rule without raising their voice and without ever hitting anyone. I mean, other methods of control. So I started out learning how to teach from people who actually taught. And we used to have this thing every year called Teachers' Day, where bizarrely little kids like me dressed up in, teachers' dresses and came in and led the classes for them. And so I think my first time teaching a class was when I was 13, taught an English class all through the day. So I had to go and teach students who were older than me as well. And that was just such an exciting experience. I knew I was going to be an English teacher back then when I was 13. And then someone lent me the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And that's when I thought, so there's a name for what my parents and their friends have been doing with railway workers and mill workers. There's a name for what I want to do with my friends in school. And I think so Freire is sort of the bedrock of some of that. But I had already got there in a way before reading that. It just put a framework on what we were already doing. And then as I got a little older, 15, 16, I started reading Bell Hooks and Hunani K. Trask and some of the Combahee River Collective and Barbara Smith and, a whole range of people who wrote about education in communities, collective education, solidarity and consciousness of one's own position in the world and one's own power and agency. And I think that was very exciting and very daunting because you were with people who really didn't think like that and who, if they didn't get a particular grade at age 15, might end up getting beaten black or blue, and some of whom felt like they'd failed for life, and some of whose parents felt they'd failed the family and failed the nation. So there was this discourse that you were fighting against, which was very instrumental. And it felt as if there was no way you could go against that tide. And so I just decided then and there that I was going to have to embody that going against the tide by refusing to compete. And refusing to compete was not something that I was reading about anywhere. It was like there were two literatures, one on instrumental education. You competed, you got better and better, and you honed your skills. And then the other one, which was in the realm of the socialist, and you sort of learned through doing. And it was actually a very stressful experience being someone who wouldn't compete in a competitive system. So I didn't try to fail, but I didn't try to succeed either. And I worked very hard to not be instrumentalized by the system. So I was very, very good at certain subjects. Geography, had a brilliant geography teacher, Mrs. Malhotra, who was an amazing person. And I refused to be put in the rankings. And then I think that has sort of come through slowly into teaching. But I can say a bit more about training as a school teacher later. But I think those are the bedrock influences.
Thank you so much, Shaku. Jillian?
Yeah, thank you. I think for me, my enthusiasm for teaching or desire to want to make change through educating people came much later, actually. It came, I think, once I got to university. And I think up until that point, I always thought I had this sort of career path for myself that was quite traditional and quite, I wanted to be a journalist and I wanted to, train in this very specific set of skills. And I sort of came to realize, I think, quite early on in my university education that actually the significant changes, personal changes that were happening to students around me, and myself included, during that period of transition, the transition from school to university, and what it means to think alongside, to learn alongside, to co-create knowledge with other people. That sort of realization, I think, was when I started to really think perhaps there's a future for myself in educating and going into that sort of space. And I think for me, again, my mentors at the first stages of my university experience were the ones that, inspired me and sort of, I think I was able to step back from that competitiveness, speaking of, that sort of drive, that ambition, that sort of drive to succeed. And I was able, I think, to step back from that and think, well, why are we all actually here? What is the purpose of this, of going to university beyond our parents told us it was the right thing to do? And so I think from then on, I had a sort of desire to work with students, to think about how to make change through education. It sort of led into postgraduate study. I was very lucky in the Canadian system. You often get teaching opportunities as a master's student, which I know is not as common in the UK. And so I was able to sort of develop my teaching practice as a master's student, actually, teaching undergrads, and had incredible mentors working with me, introducing me to pedagogy scholarship, to sort of start to develop that practice from a very sort of young age. So I felt by the time I got to the LSE, actually, I had a couple of years of teaching experience under my belt, and I was then excited to take on, deeper pedagogical training and things like that, practices through what I was doing here at LSE. And I think, bell hooks has already been mentioned. I think that was probably my introduction into inclusive pedagogies, as it was for many people, I think, particularly when I came to the LSE. I think now my work with first-year undergraduate students and thinking about what we do at LSE 100, which engages every single first-year student at the school, I think quite a lot and quite deliberately about what it means to educate in an inclusive way, in an accessible way. And I think in terms of scholarship, I am inspired by your work, Akile, and I'm delighted that we get to work together regularly on different projects and initiatives, because I think that has really helped to develop my own teaching practice. I will shout out a couple of other people that I use their work and think about their work a lot. So Anne Gagné, who's a Canadian scholar, works on accessibility pedagogy. Her blog, I will give a shout out to her blog, which is all things pedagogical. And I think that she creates such an open space, I think, for actually tough conversations about where we are complicit and what kinds of practices we want to develop as educators. I'll also mention Max Libron, who's an Indigenous scholar working on in my home of Newfoundland. They essentially run a sort of anti-colonial research lab, a collective anti-colonial research lab. And that, I think, has really connected to a lot of the pedagogy that we have tried to develop at LSE 100, what it means to think collectively, to learn collectively, and inclusively. So I think those folks, alongside a whole host of mentors and teachers that I've had over the years, have all played some role in getting to where I am now, but I'm very much still learning.
Thanks, Jillian. And Michael?
Well, to try and boil down so much into so short a time. When I was at school, there was no expectation on me to go to university. Nobody in my family had gone to university. I was incredibly lucky. I went to a state school which had an elder brother go through the same school 4 years before me, which was in a really bad state and very low expectations of pupils at this school. And then it was kind of turned around by a good head teacher. I mean, turned around in the sense at least having some kind of structure and discipline, but in a constructive way, I would say. And at that school, I said earlier, I was inspired by a geography teacher, but I learned at that time, amongst my peer group, the incredible cultural norm not to study. That somehow, the terms they use, like swatting, you're a swat, what are you wasting your time for? Let's go out and play football or something. Yes, and I never got that. Even when I was young, I thought, well, surely this is about one of the few ways we have to get on in life. If you haven't got any wealth, your own kind of abilities, your brain, your intelligence, your skills, whatever they may be, insofar as they can be enhanced in the school environment. So I was kind of fortunate in maybe grasping that, but also having a very, very loving family background where my parents were just whatever you want to do, which I think I've seen the mental sort of casualties of later on at university, of people under incredibly sort of competitive and pressured environments where the entire family has gone to Oxbridge, and if they don't get a first, then they failed their entire life, which is ridiculous, of course. But at the school, I had these teachers, and this has formed my educational kind of understanding, which become more theorized over time. But I think the essence is still essentially the same, which is basically learning in terms of doing, learning in terms of finding out about the world, often by talking to people in their environments. In geography with traditional fieldwork, which later on I knew is incredibly problematic in terms of geography was an imperial discipline, and it fed sort of informed colonial conquest. But it had this, at least when I was taught it at school by the teachers, I had this idea of finding out by yourself how the world is. And this reference is going to date me incredibly, but when I was at school, we had a trip up to the northeast field trip during the miners' strike, and we were supposed to go down a mine, and they were on strike, so we couldn't go down the mine. So we went to the meeting hall with the miners, and they told us why they were on strike. And we'd come from I grew up in the south of England, sort of where you got bombarded with Conservative MP, bombarded by right-wing media, where the miners were demonized in the press at the time. They suffered incredibly sort of violent police tactics. And we went out there, and my father worked on a farm all his life, so he already had within the family, my mother as well, some idea of strong sense of fairness, if not flag waving left-wing politics. And my father always had a strong sense of, you should look into, do not take for granted what people say to you. He had a very good, what I would call land wisdom, my father. He left school very young, but he worked on the land all his life. And he dealt with people in terms of that, I expect you to be truthful and honest to me. And he was very good at spotting people that weren't. And I remember when we went up to Newcastle, met the miners, and we did other trips during our trip to Newcastle. That was a real eye-opener. Okay, these people are not as portrayed in the media. Of course they're not. You would say these days. But when you're young schoolboy, you think, well, okay, I can see this method is right, that when you want to teach or investigate something or research something, you find out for yourself in an honest, objective way, okay? And that then developed in terms of my experience. I did well at school. I was kind of a late developer. And then my teacher said, well, maybe you should think about university. Really? Okay, all right. And then the sort of supportive structure. And then being incredibly privileged to be one of the last individuals, I think, or the generations that got funded for my education. And thinking, I may not have done that. I may not have done that if that funding were not there. There was no money, and I would probably have got a job, yeah? But again, thinking about the support structure which is there, And in terms of like, this was only intellectualized later on as I became a sort of university student. And in terms of what we call now experiential learning, which is a big thing for us in geography, let's go out. We still use the term in the field, which I know is problematic for various terms. But I was inspired when I was a student I went into the university library where I was a student and saw this big sort of book on the shelf sticking out, looked quite sort of big pictures on. And I pulled it out the shelf. This is quite different. This is when we had this wonderful thing where you walk around the library as a student, sort of serendipity and learning, which I still advise. I sort of say to my students, go to the library, look at the books next to the one we recommended. So there might be something interesting there. But anyway, I pulled this book out, and it was by an American radical geographer called Bill Bunge. And he lived in this inner city sort of neighborhood, black neighborhood predominantly in Detroit in the late 60s, where there were all sorts of riots going on. And he did this intense ethnographic kind of historical geography of this community called Fitzgerald. And it's written with the community. And he goes right back to kind of slavery, plantations, we go back to indigenous dispossession of the land. And there's this, and it's in your face. It's uncompromising in terms of its language, and it's speaking truth to power, which is the big thing that I've learned in terms of finding out about how the world works, being prepared to speak truth to power. And so that articulated that for me. And I got really fired up. I saw that as a first year. I thought, well, this is geography. And I quickly found out it's not. It was a part of geography. This guy actually lost his job later on for being so far out with his. I mean, a lot of the ideas now have caught up, but he was not the celebrated geographer. He didn't play the game. Yeah, he ended up as a taxi driver in Canada. But anyway, so I got this sense of, okay, this is possible to have experiential learning, which is something other than studying rivers, yeah, or doing surveys of shoppers in Reading. There's something other here that we can do. So that's kind of informed me. Later on, as with both of you, that Paulo Freire talks about something called co-investigation, like learning about and with people, and creating a kind of educational experience which is inherently interactive. But in terms of the earlier school sort of experience, I then came across much later as a student. There's this book by a sociologist in the 70s by Paul Willis called Learning to Labour, Why Working Class Kids Get Working Class Jobs. And I thought, well, that's the culture I experienced. Absolutely there. This sort of cultural, sort of normative, sort of background, which says, it's not for you to go in that direction. I still get really upset by certain celebrities who celebrate ignorance, like the Gallagher brothers, Oasis, I thought, or used to be anyway. Any kind of sort of celebration of it's okay not to study. Look at us, we've been successful. Yes. What else? So So I kind of theorized some of these ideas later, seeing the literature, teaching literature, and then tried to do that in terms of the teaching environment here at LSE, learn to be a teacher. But you're within certain constraints. You're always within certain constraints in terms of a syllabi, expectations for the discipline, and usually the discipline is behind where the students are, behind often where you want to go. So that's why I think, Akile, the Inclusive Education Action Plan here at LSE has given us a wonderful sort of opportunity to push in directions which are sometimes even beyond where our discipline is in terms of thinking about teaching education, partly because in the university environment, particularly kind of so-called Russell Group university environment, there's a celebration or over-emphasis, we might argue, in terms of research relative to teaching, rather than thinking about them as a kind of symbiotic relationship.
Thanks, Michael. It's interesting hearing all of you. And it's weird because for me, bell hooks did change the way I saw geography. So it was less about the teaching, but more about I sort of went into doing an undergrad in geography because I'd enjoyed it at secondary school. I actually like this idea of people in the environment and how they engage with space. And I knew I had to go to university. Like for me, my parents were like, immigrant parents, you'll go to university. There's no other choices for you. You've got to go to university. So that pressure to do well was so intense, and there was no room for failure. And I felt that geography met my needs in the sense that it was a creative subject, but not so creative that my parents would say, oh, what are you going to do with that exactly? So in their heads, oh, she's going to be a geography teacher. But I remember geography was incredibly white. Even when I started my degree in 2000, and it was incredibly white. And I did my undergraduate at Queen Mary. And even there, when I went to see it, I was like, this is a great university. It's a bit like where I went to school. This is like my sixth form. It's going to be fine being here. And it wasn't actually, because the discipline itself was white, and what was being taught was white, and the people teaching were still old methods of dictation. I remember one professor dictating to us in the class, and I was like, is this how it's going to be for the next 3 years? And luckily someone handed me a book by bell hooks, and I read a chapter about home as a site of love and not resistance. And at that point, a lot of feminist geographers were talking about home as the site of resistance and public and private spaces. And for me, home was never a site of resistance, actually, or this kind of divided up because of labour. It was the one place I felt myself. And I could be myself. I could speak as loudly as I want. I could laugh as loudly as I want. Because it was always told to me, this is the way you behave when you're outside of the home. This is how you can behave at home. And everything was very coded in my life. I remember that. And then reading bell hooks, reading Edward Said's Out of Place, that memoir really kind of got me thinking, well, this isn't what geography is, actually. It is about the intersections of race and space and those identities. But as I went through and decided, I had a really great tutor, and he said, why don't you think about doing a PhD? And I didn't know what a PhD was. And so I thought about it and thought, right, I'm good at research. I really love doing research. But then I started to see that if you do work on race, it is really difficult to be valued. And at that time, we've moved on, I'd say, a bit more. But the conversation is like, we're in a post-race era. We don't need to talk about race. There is no racism anymore. So it was incredibly difficult. And I was constantly fighting about my research and trying to uphold what I believed in and the truth of my research. It was always constantly questioned. And then I had the opportunity to do some teaching while I was doing my PhD. And I got to teach students that were like myself and were from similar neighbourhoods and understood me. And it was such a moment. I thought, I'm not the best teacher, but I'm connecting on a whole other level. And then I was saying, right, read this, read that. It's not on your curriculum, right? Sneaking things in that weren't on the curriculum, but enabling me to give a bit of myself as well in that teaching relationship. And then, I've been really lucky to, I had a wonderful mentor when I finished my PhD. I was lucky enough to get an RA position at Goldsmith. And I'm going to do a shout out to Claudia Bernard, who has completely, she changed my entire life. I get really emotional talking about her, but she taught me how to be a better researcher. She taught me how to be a teacher. And, and she, she's still very much part of my life. And I can't say that about the people that I met as an undergraduate, actually. I've distanced myself so much from that journey as an undergrad. And even the PhD for me was a difficult thing to do. But I thought these are the possibilities of, and then coming here and trying to, channel my inner Claudia most of the time when I'm in these different spaces. And, meeting, Shaku, who's here as well, Coretta Phillips. I remember talking to Coretta, who was, the things she does as a teacher to place herself in the classroom, because social class and race and gender intersecting in a place like the LSE, people question whether you're right to be here. And I still get questioned. So yeah, it's been really lovely hearing all of your stories, and I like the geography connections actually here. So I'm going to move on and to ask you all about kind of what areas are you still developing, trying to work through when it comes to kind of implementing this idea of inclusive pedagogies. And I'm using that really broadly. There's anti-racist pedagogies, there's decolonial pedagogies, and then also some of the challenges and barriers you encounter in the process. I'll go to you, Jillian.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think it feels very much like a process and a journey. And I'm often struck by actually how much a different cohort of students can throw up new challenges, new opportunities as well. And year on year, I think, having been teaching on LSE 100 now for 8 years, I've found that to be quite, I guess, a dramatic shift. We've changed the course a lot, we've changed how we teach, but I think the students have changed a lot. I think the kinds of students we have on the course, but also the things that students want to raise, that they want to engage with, has changed over that amount of time. And I think for me, inclusive pedagogies has at its core this idea of a shared common baseline for all. So rather than pedagogies that focus on difference or on adding difference or on increasing diversity by looking at a reading list. And not to say that that's not an important part of what inclusive pedagogy is, but it's not where it ends. And I think that for me, that's been a real realization over the past several years of working on the course. And so a lot of what we think about, because we work as a teaching team, because there's 10 or 12 or more of us working on the course at any one time with different disciplinary backgrounds, with different lived experience that we bring into the role, I think a lot of the time we spend is actually coming to some shared understandings about what we want an LSE 100 classroom to feel like for all of our students. And that means a space that is principled, right? A space where students will be challenged, will feel uncomfortable perhaps with some of the topics that we're discussing, but that there are sort of shared principles of understanding, even when there are differences in language, particularly disciplinary differences that come into those spaces. I think even at first year undergrad level, I'm often shocked by how inculcated students already are with disciplinary biases, really. And their disciplinary identity has already formed in quite a distinct way that often results in conflict and in tension with other students. So I think a lot of what we do is, in terms of thinking about inclusive pedagogies, is how do you facilitate those conversations in a way that engages students, that offers students material, so that's readings, lecture content, video content, but also case study content to engage with, so that they feel as though they can make contributions in class, despite potential sort of disagreements or very different understandings. If you ask a first-year economist, what's your idea of a fair market, you're going to get a very different answer than if you ask a first-year anthropology student, right? Which is great, and I think that's one of the real values of what we do in the course. But I think navigating those tensions and those conflicts is something that we're constantly working on. I think one of the big things, and this might come up later, but I guess when we're thinking about what we still need to do and where are those barriers, where are those obstacles, for me, one of the really interesting things that I've seen in the past couple of years is this insistence from many of our groups. So we have students working on group projects. They're term-long group projects, quite interdisciplinary. We're asking them to put forward a proposal to make positive change in a system, right? To identify a problem and then put forward a proposal. A lot of those groups insist on focusing on the US or the UK in their case study work, in their research work, even though they have seen all year during the course a much broader range of experience, right? We intentionally look at many cases situated in the Global South, for example. We try really hard to present a range of lived experiences when it comes to questions of fair society or climate catastrophe or the effects of artificial intelligence, because none of those problems are US and UK focused only, right? And so that's one of the areas that I think is a real puzzle for me. And actually thinking about it, talking to students about it, their sort of desire to focus on US and UK case studies often, I think, and this sounds too simple, but I think this is actually might be part of the reason. It's the Google effect. It's this idea that students do not walk into a library anymore, by and large. First-year undergraduate students in particular are not walking around the stacks looking at texts from a range of different scholars. What they're doing is typing in the problem or the particular area that they want to focus on into Google. And the first results that are coming up on a search engine that is trained on data largely from the global north unsurprisingly, are US-UK case studies. And so I think part of what we want to do is to shift students' thinking about what it means to make change in the world, what it means to propose change, what it means to investigate problems and challenges that particular societies or groups or organizations are facing, and that those problems are not unique to the UK or to the US.
Do you think, just to ask you a question on that, Jillian, is it also they perceive the expectation is that it should be about the UK and the US, right? So you come in educated in the Western way, and I certainly have been, and so you assume that is what, and so is it up to us to say to them, right, there is, X amount of countries, and not to just sort of differentiate between this notion of the global north and the global south. There are countries, it's not just in this big homogenous area of the global south. And then sometimes you will get pushback, I think. I certainly have had that, Why do we need to talk about X country over there when we have our own problems in our own borders? I'm just sort of thinking, and then,
I think that's absolutely right. And I think part of it is on us to make those pathways available to students. I think also there's a sense in which what students are doing is also a reflection of the academy, by and large, right? And so the fact that there are all of these investigations and research studies and, large research studies done on US and UK populations, makes it easier for a first-year undergrad who's looking for a bit of data to find, right? Of course, there are issues, too, around English language publications. We know that it's, often difficult if we want to engage with scholarship from particular parts of the Global South, and we're looking at English language scholarship. We then have to think about the coloniality of that and what that means for particular types of scholarship, I think. But I agree with you. I think there's an expectation there that is likely built in to how many of our students are educated. Not all, but many. And I think we do see that in the course quite a bit.
Thank you. Shaku?
So thinking about challenges, I suppose I've been very privileged to work with little kids because I think engaging young people of different generations, so what it meant to engage an 11-year-old in 1992 and what it means to engage one today has changed. And I was also privileged to be a media and communications teacher very early on, even though I was teaching English and doing a lot of philosophical stuff from undergrad. And like Michael, I also would never have gone to university had I not been one of the last 3 years to pick up the free tuition at university. And I would have never done a PhD had I not got a scholarship to do so. These things were all barriers, and I worked my master's through night school as a teacher. And so being aware of the children's class backgrounds and what it meant to them to be in school was a huge thing. Like Michael, I was also really interested in the challenge of getting people to show up in their full humanity and sociality in the classroom. Now, what does that mean? You can do that with 11-year-olds because they're actually still quite physical in some ways. With undergrads, that's getting more difficult. But I'm still trying to do that with master students and doctoral students. And getting someone to show up in their full humanity in an institutional context where you don't set the parameters and where racism and classism are absolutely baked into the system, where certain types of misogyny are just everyday practices, where people are queerphobic, not because they really think about homosexuality or homophobia, but because it's just the easiest thing for them to do. And that means from the management of your local school, your local authority back in the day to the management of the LSE today, it's just much easier to go with the elite mob than it is to think through what it means for your students to feel safe in the classroom that you've invited them into. So there are sort of multiple different things going on here. I'm still trying to get people who wouldn't go to university into a position that they can go to university. 30 years later, I'm still trying to get people who are hearing impaired to be able to say, I'm hearing impaired and I can do this. You need to make it possible for me to do this. Or people who suffer extreme anxiety and depression to say, that's not my fault, but you can help me through this. And I recognize you and your mental health struggles, and this place can be for me. Or people who have been biracial in a context where everyone was black or biracial, coming into the UK system to just understand that racism is different in different places and it doesn't figure the same way. Or people who can come in through a border but then can't leave to go anywhere else because it would take 1 month and a rejection of your visa to, understand that you're not wanted or that you're suspicious to other people. So in that classroom where there are all these inequalities, 30 years ago, although I was teaching in quite a homogenous Southeast London school, these were all things that actually mattered and came up again and again. And one of the ways that I've learned to deal with this again, as I said, when I was a child, I did it through being embodied. Again, it was through being embodied, by putting yourself out there, by saying, this is me, this happened to me. Is it happening to you? I'm queer, but I'm also this. I want a different world. I want to break these things down. I understand if you don't. Your parents made you go to church every day, or you pray 5 times a day. What does that mean for you and me to have this relationship with me being queer? And can you sort of recognize my humanity and me recognize yours? And that's something I think that you do and you model for them. And I think you can model that for doctoral students, and you can model that for your colleagues, and you can keep doing that and showing up again and again and again. And one of the things that has enabled me to do that is in parallel always being and doing other things than teaching. So Michael and I for many years have been together in, can I say this, trade unions. We think trade unions are a parallel structure. People don't just get born knowing how to be in a trade union movement. You have to teach them what does it mean. And of course, the trade union movement, just like other institutions, is full of biases. When I first joined the National Union of Teachers, when I was a very young teacher, my entire branch was white. And whenever I stood up to speak, I spoke for about 3 seconds before being cut off by a man who was in the Socialist Workers' Party and should have known better, but felt that I didn't have anything to contribute, And of course, left groups in the UK are also very white, and environmentalist groups in the UK are also very white. And yet I want to train my students to be able to engage with, and my largely Global South, largely people of color students, to engage with those movements and push for social change. So it's all about getting people to feel safe enough, or making a space safe enough, which you've invited people into and you've said it's safe. And no space is entirely safe, but that's a huge project. And you can do that in multiple ways. Jillian mentioned the curriculum. You can do that through the curriculum. And in my case, it isn't that they're at all interested in British and US politics. They've come with many, many other histories and struggles to the LSE. They're thinking of Uganda, they're thinking of Tanzania, they're thinking of Turkey, they're thinking of India and China, and they don't come from a homogenous perspective on that. Some of them have come from families which are, I think we should say it, they're fascists. And LSE is the first time that they are hearing their thoughts critical of misogyny or fascism articulated within a pedagogic framework. Or it's the first time when their own casteism or racism is being challenged. And that's a huge thing in the classroom. You can do that through the curriculum by having a really, really deep dive into and respectful conversation with types of texts, angry texts, literary texts in a sociology context, getting texts to talk to each other. But you can also do that by getting students to work through stuff on their own. So, and this is risky, and I know it's risky, getting people to think about their relationships and talk those through. So I teach, and I'm just going to talk about one aspect of what I teach. I teach a lot about children and childhood because abiding passion of mine. I teach a class on film theory. You might not think film theory would be the place where by week 9, we would end up having incredibly intimate, personal, and difficult conversations about childhood. but we do. We start the course talking about Barthian semiotics, but we end the course thinking about self-reflexivity. And I think we have a session in which everyone talks about childhood on screen, but we do that through thinking about our own childhood and who we are in relation to childhood. And of course, childhood is a big space in geography. So I give them a reading by a geographer, Stuart Hansen, who talks about 4 different films from different locations. And we ask the question, is childhood universal or particular? And the exercise I give them is incredibly simple. I just ask them to think of the top 3 words they associate with their childhood, and I do the exercise with them. And so we get words like protected, pedagogized, lonely, or safe, loved, traumatic, or hungry, lonely. And then you begin, and then I give them each space to tell the narrative of those stories. And we think about the films we've watched, and we watch an Australian film that week, which is about a community which is breaking down because of racism. There's been a racist murder of an Aboriginal young woman, and then the community is breaking down. It's called Jindabyne, and it combines geography, history, sort of social politics. But there are 2 little children in that who are trying to make sense of the film, and then they're thinking of their childhood in relation to the film childhood. And by this time, it's 9 weeks into the course, 10 weeks into the course. These are students who never knew each other before. They started in the Michaelmas term. Some of them are older, maybe like in their early 30s, and some of them are 21. Some of them, and you hear stories about childhoods, people who grew up, they were dropped with a grandparent in the village at age 3 and saw their parents twice between then and the age of 15, or people whose mothers put them into pageants when they were little and went to pageants, or the nicest stories, of course, are the parents who were just completely accepting the way yours were, Michael, and just encouraged people to be how they were. But at the end of that exercise, there is nobody who is not in tears in the room. And of course, we have to deal with all kinds of therapeutic issues, such as abuse and rape and incredible amounts of bullying and mental health trauma and lack of funds, and a sacrifice on the part of some parents who've just constantly put themselves second in order to allow their children to succeed. And sort of this mixture of love and, you mentioned bell hooks and love. I mean, I think this understanding of what is abuse and what is love is something that I want my students to take through into their work in development organizations and their work with communities and their work with each other when they're doing research in communities. That's something that they need to take through. But the tension I'm working with is that the institution is modeling an absolutely different form of being a student and form of being a person. The institution is modeling, just to give you an example, what it means to be tough but fair in a neoliberal environment. And I think, you could say LSE likes to think of itself as fair and can be fair at times. As a negotiator for a trade union, I'd have to say sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't, but that the people that they regard as successful, whom they bring in to talk at, convocations, are bankers and right-wing politicians. And if that's your model of what successful personhood means, what's going on in my classroom where you're acknowledging each other's humanity? Am I just making my students even more unsafe? Am I setting them up for failure? So I think the challenge for me is actually wanting to get loads of different people from different backgrounds who are stigmatized or perhaps have never thought of themselves as traditionally coming into education here, through making special cases for people, through saying, well, actually grades is not the only thing I want to do. I'm not comparing myself to Oxford or Cambridge. I want to compare these students to their potential and to what they could do, but then doing that in a context where they will not be supported or where they might experience racism and other forms of microaggression on a daily basis, like the erasure of your Palestinian identity, or just being bombarded with hate speech here in the UK, like some of our East Asian students were at the beginning of the pandemic, or Islamophobia every time you try to get a visa, and I'm bringing them in a way into an unsafe space, they're going to go back into that anyway, but perhaps they learn some of the ways of navigating the harm. And so I think the other thing about the classroom is that caring and healing aspect of it. For me, it always has to be that. And I've failed if they've just come in and learned a curriculum and done incredibly well, got a distinction and left. Something's left out of that. So it's a much, much longer process, I think, than simply the 1 year. These things will resonate for a decade afterwards.
Thank you, Shaku. Michael?
My experience in LSE is, in my department anyway, is that the students have been at the vanguard of change, and have been saying to us, why do we not have more sort of diversity in coverage of the syllabus, but not just in terms of geographical regions, also some of the ideas. Why do we only get this type of economics or this type of development? Yeah, and of course they're exposed to that across the school, and you know, we talk to them. We have diversity of ideas at the school, of ideas of education as well as politics or geography or development. And it'd be interesting to see that kind of gradually shift. But as you say, Shaku, with an institutional environment which is probably quite, for whatever reason, inertial politics, quite resistant to some of those ideas. So one of the things that the sort of the recent curriculum work I've done for the Middle East Centre has been really interesting to me, and I think rewarding, and potentially of interest to others, is that starting off from a position within a research project where there was no constraints on what we do. The research project is looking at the sort of occupied Syrian Golan Heights. Okay, so you've got, you know, the situation. Summer 1967, we have from the Golan Heights, 127,000 people forcibly displaced, 95% of the population. 6,000 left, 6,000 Syrians left in 4 or 5 villages in the north. And we undertook a research project with Palestinian University, Bezait University, this is between 2018 and 2021, and an NGO called Al-Marsad in the Golan Heights, a human rights NGO, about understanding with the community their kind of historical geography, particularly 67, and then in particular since 81, when the Golan Heights were annexed by Israel under the Golan Heights law. And one of the things which came up, and again, this wasn't planned in terms of research initially, is we found out through our research, with a sort of network of researchers, including master's students. This was the first educational kind of contribution or input, as it were. It was with a class of master's students at Bezait University. They have a master's in Israeli studies. And we used this research project as both informing research on the region, but also using inviting students in to be kind of co-researchers on the project, including later on. Then we brought on, there were some students already from the Golan Heights, others from the Golan Heights. And one of the things that, we already had an idea that we'd create some kind of curriculum for use initially at Bezait University in their Israeli Studies Masters on the Golan Heights, because nothing was there in terms of curriculum material. And then this kind of grew because as we did more research, and one of the students was looking into the educational context in the Golan Heights, and this will not be a surprise, anybody knows sort of Palestinian politics, is when the Golan Heights was occupied by Israel in summer 67, they completely sort of changed the educational environment. Teachers opposed to the occupation were sacked. They moved into an Israeli school curriculum, which denied the children's Syrian kind of identity, Syrian heritage, Syrian history. So what the community did, this was only 6,000 people at the time, is over time they created alternative summer camps for their children, which were usually in an open air environment. They put tents up. If they organized it, would be stopped. So sometimes these were done almost quite covertly. Sometimes the Israelis would turn up and arrest everybody, but they set these camps up, annual summer camps with tents, and they'll teach the kids about their culture and identity and the history. And I was fascinated by this. And one of the students who worked on this written a chapter in the book that we published on this, about this alternative educational environment. Meanwhile, in the traditional schools, most of these kids come from villages. Most of these kids are in communities which self-identify as Druze, or many of them are becoming more secular. But anyway, so there's ways going, okay, we'll give you the Druze curriculum. The Druze, there's actually a maths for Druze, English for Druze. And they thought, well, you'd be like the Israeli Druze. They're quite compliant. Yeah, I'm sure it'd be fine. It wasn't. So no. We resist this. We still recognize, we still identify ourselves as Syrian. We want to teach our kids about their own identity and heritage. So you have a very, very, very political, contested situation. So then, I think, well, okay, how can I be useful? Incredibly kind of, what can we do at LSE from a privileged position to learn about, but also possibly support a community? And I'm thinking, this is a privilege born partly out of becoming more secure in terms of employment. And for me, there's a kind of not just opportunity, but almost obligation and responsibility that if you have that space and you've identified some area of injustice, for example, why not go there? That may not get you research funding, it may not get you the articles in the top star journals, but when you retire eventually, at least you can look back and say, well, I did try and do something useful. Yeah, I don't care. I may not have got an OBE or CBE or whatever. I've got a seat in the House of Lords. I don't want that. I did actually do something useful. Yeah, something in terms of something. At least approaching the idea of supporting a more just situation. So in terms of education, one of the things we did was develop this curriculum based on this series of research projects in a socio-political environment in which the people, the communities who are involved with us in this research are suffering segregation, dispossession, all the things that Palestinians suffer. And then you find, okay, the materials aren't there. We have to create things from anew. Even the archive, creating a sort of counter-archive, photographing, finding sources. And the idea of, it's very, very instructive to look at education in a situation where the social, political, and cultural conditions for free education do not exist. Yeah? And thinking, how do you go into that situation? That's where actually kind of we discovered Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, because it kind of gives you a roadmap of situations with communities suffering systemic discrimination, domination. How do you develop, we would say, a counter-hegemonic education? And and I think the LSE, fortunately, at least in this country, there are some legal freedoms around academic research, that if you can go into that situation and do something and create a kind of a living curriculum, and in this context, of course, the archive, the website we developed, the curriculum is in Arabic, of course, as well as English, because there's a whole politics of language. There's a whole politics of language. This is something Bell Hook talks about in terms of vernacular sort of English, is that the whole research evaluation in the UK is, of course, based on, it's Anglophonic. There's a strong Anglophonic bias there. You have to, and we saw in terms of the training of the students, because we, in the Golan Heights and in Bezait University, having to negotiate that thing where the kind of Western expectations on what they would, how they conduct research, come up against their lived experience, okay, in terms of like so-called objectivity of language, of method, of how you cite sources, how you use sources. So when you're dealing with a community where the community is under conditions of systemic kind of domination, the how education responds is very, very interesting. How you create conditions for free education or freer education with the Palestinians, for example, under the first Intifada, or uprising, they had flying universities. Israelis closed down Bezek universities, so all the academics went around and they taught outside the university gates or somewhere else. When the schools are closed, the teachers organise alternative spaces. So what we're seeing in the Golan Heights was just another example of that alternative educational space. And of course, the challenge there is the opportunity to develop something which nobody else seemed to be developing. It made me think, why is this not being developed? All these fantastically well-endowed American foundations are funding all sorts of projects on justice and inclusion. Why is this different? Why is the Golan Heights different? Why is Palestine different? Yeah? Why is this? And that makes me even more determined to sort of, okay, let's do more on that. Because if that seems to be an area where it's off limits, why is it off limits? And thinking about what off limits means in terms of language, research, and education. Because if we can't do that at LSE, who can do that? Yeah. So I think that I'm kind of alluding to a kind of political institutional environment where certain types of inclusive education is acceptable, and other types of inclusive education is seen beyond the pale. And our responsibility as educators, academics, is interrogating that. Why are we comfortable talking about inclusion in this situation, but not this situation?
Thanks, Michael. Lots to think about. And I guess I'm just thinking about my own position in the school, because you kind of operate in that liminal space of having to work, with management, but also having my own identity, my own scholarship, informing everything that I do and informing me. And it really struck me what you were saying, Shaku, about humanity and like Sylvia Winter's work on seeing each other's humanity. Then it got me thinking about this whole discourse around resilience, right? Let's make our students be more resilient. They have to be more resilient. Why do they need mentorship? They should just be able to go in and get their heads down. And it also got me then thinking about a wonderful graduate intern that worked with me, Tamina. And she did really well at university. She got a first, she came here and got a distinction in her master's. But then there was these conversations around kind of, we've got grade awarding gaps and, racialized students are not getting first. And yes, that is true. But some of them are, many of them are as well, actually, but at a cost of their humanity, actually, and conforming to this model. And as educators, it's our responsibility, like you say, to see their humanity. But at the same time, we're in this space that can be really restrictive on who you are and what you want to do. And what you were saying, Michael, the things we can research and what is deemed valuable research, what is, the REF, the TEF, all these metrics now. How do we just teach and be good teachers and be better teachers and constantly learn from one another and learn from our students, learn from people outside of the academy? It's not just people that have qualifications in particular ways that inform the things that we do. Your mother, I certainly know I wouldn't be here if my mother hadn't been reading my PhD. She had no idea what it was about, really. But she sat there night after night and read it. And, that's really transformed the way that I think. And I'm just sort of thinking about the challenges, really, and then how do we work through those challenges and how do we challenge the institution? Because some of this is about challenging the university, and this isn't unique to here. As I said, I've worked in many places. Many of us have worked in different universities. How do we do this without it being something that management dictates to us as a way of doing? Because we run the risk of inclusive pedagogy being this exercise of, here you go, here's a toolkit. If you're doing all of these things, you're a good teacher, you're an inclusive teacher. But that's not how it works. And I think that's something that's come out from our discussions today. There's no toolkit to this, right? So throwing out a comment and a question to you all to think about as we try and think about how we close the conversation. Shaku.
Okay, how do we not be co-opted but also push the boundaries?
Yes.
I want to say something about emotion because, 2 or 3 times during this conversation, listening to you and when you mentioned Max's work on sort of environment and methodology, and when Michael talked about your family, Michael, and then the miners' strike, which was a huge, huge thing for me growing up, absolutely sort of set the parameters of how I thought about industrial relations, strikes, and then you talking about, when you didn't see yourself in the classroom, and then when you read Bell Hooks, I felt very tearful, and I feel very emotional about people who take risks, and what that risk looks like is really different for different people. And actually, bizarrely, I'm not, despite being a trade unionist and negotiator, I'm not someone who doesn't believe in sort of organizational change. I think we can have organizational change, but that organizational change happens, and I'm obviously professor of social change in some way. It happens within a political context, which is much, much wider than the institution. And so there are sort of words that fill my head which haven't yet become the buzzwords of academia. So you can use the word inclusion and diversity, and it'll soon, very soon, become part of a capitalist mode of producing students or producing property, which is what the university appears to have become in the UK, a mode of producing property by consuming staff and sausage factorying students, which I think is very depressing. But that's the dominant mode coming from the US to the UK, and that's what's happening in terms of lots of aspects of our lives, healthcare. And so I believe firmly in free education and free healthcare, and I believe in, equity and justice. What does that mean in a real life context? What does that mean when I also have the power to mark my students' work and mark them up or down for not agreeing with me, because we can be very authoritarian as teachers, even if we have socialist ideals, and I mean, my experience is always that one needs to look for those places of hypocrisy and then be brave. Now, what does that mean to be brave in that context? Well, when you're a very young and inexperienced teacher, it means having quite fierce arguments with people who are much more experienced than you about what quality looks like in students' writing when you're assessing it, or in their speaking when they talk to you. And that's a frightening thing to do. And I want to speak here both as a sort of call out to someone who was a very dear friend and mentor, but whom I also fought constantly. And she's now dead. She died last year of brain cancer. And she was just an amazing, teacher and person, and was amazing with the students, but was always trying to get me to think about quality in terms of better writing. And she was also, like you, Michael, from a working class British background, and had just fiercely fought everything to be a sort of early feminist in the classroom, wonderful educator, but quite draconian, and experienced as quite frightening by the students. And so my learning was also about diverging from a mentor and understanding what was good about what they had to give, but fighting her. And she said to me, I've never had a trainee teacher who fought me as much as you did on every single issue. And, we would moderate GCSE work together, which meant something, because if you got an A, you might go to university. And if you got a D, you might not. And grades mean something in terms of social class and people's lives. And so this discourse of quality to me is a gatekeeping exercise. And I'm saying that, and I do think there's quality, but I just have an alternative schema in my head of what quality looks like. And I have that when I'm reading the applications. So it's kind of like a cradle to grave thing. When I read the applications, I'm looking for different things than other people are looking for. And I think, speaking to what you said, what can we do? So we can subvert, but I don't believe in doing that secretly in the shadows. I believe in trying to persuade everyone to do it with me, also at the same time trying to change institutional structures, also at the same time trying to appeal to our management, and fight them. To appeal to them and fight them. I want to do both those things. And I will fight them when I think they're being hypocritical, So when they enact homophobic and queerphobic and transphobic policies, and they do so because they are following the trend of far-right activism around the world, and it leads to an easier life for them, I will call them out publicly. I will also privately try to appeal to them. When they cut the salaries of staff who are striking because salaries are not livable at the moment and because conditions are not livable, I will call them out both publicly and privately, but I will also try to negotiate. There's no either or, and I'm trying to teach the students that being revolutionary can sometimes be a really boring, slow, small process of looking through spreadsheets and spotting something, And I think it's not, cut off their heads. Although, occasionally you might feel like that. I think it's also about giving space to students' anger. And I do want to address one thing that you talked about, which is in an institution like this, we experience and we meet people who are from very, very economically conservative and right-wing backgrounds. This just absolutely goes without saying. And if I started off saying, this is a socialist curriculum, by the end of it, you're going to read Marx and love him, they would be out the door or there would be complaints. So it's about a slow process of just getting them to see the hypocrisies, the harms, the lack of integrity in so much of capitalist society, including the capitalist education system, and just doing that really, really rigorously through one's own research, through other people's research, through books and stories. And they're going to hear completely different things from one's colleagues. I count on that. There's going to be debate. There is no shutting down of that debate. I want to hear from the students who think business is wonderful. Let's do business. And I want them either to make their own journey to a different position or to stay in their position. I have absolutely no interest in forcing them by saying, you'll get marked down if you don't do this. Forcing them to take a view that is either more open or more akin to justice than the one they came in with. So it's a journey, but there is space for them to say those things. And there is space in the classroom for people to explore, why am I racist? Because many of us are, And I discover constantly new forms of racism in myself, in my background, and so do they. But it's a vulnerability, it's taking risk. Integrity is something that's in really short supply in the current institutional context, and it's devalued. But I think we should value it more.
Thank you, Shaku and Jillian.
I think thinking about the institutional context and sort of what do we do at LSE, because I think there are similarities and differences with other institutions, for sure. But I think there are some idiosyncrasies, perhaps, that exist here that we need to confront. And Shaku does confront on a daily basis. And I think that kind of work is something that we need to push, and in our own ways, in our own spaces, in our own departments, divisions, etc., as members of staff at this institution, is to push. And I'm thinking here specifically about a culture at this institution of departmental autonomy. And so a result where students coming into this institution have wildly different experiences, depending on what department they end up in. And that comes all the way from having the experience of, feeling like you've really changed and been enlightened and you've reached these new understandings, to feeling as though your identity as a person has been denied. And that breadth of experience at LSE for students, in my view, is not acceptable. We cannot ethically accept students into this institution and have that level of diversity, and here I'm saying diversity in a pejorative way, right, in experience. And so, yes, departmental autonomy, yes, freedom within a framework, to use a buzz phrase of this institution. But how do we get people on side? How do we ensure that people are listening to this podcast that probably wouldn't come to an event with this topic title? And that, I think, is the question. And I wish I had a great answer. I wish I had something that could get us there. And I think that there is that risk of feeling like inclusive pedagogies and inclusive education gets co-opted as soon as we start talking about, well, how do we make sure this is happening everywhere? Because we know that we have allies. We know there are allies across the school in lots of different places doing amazing work with their students. But how do we spread that? And how do we at least ensure a common baseline of an inclusive experience, however we want to define that, for our students? And an experience that allows students to embrace their full humanity and their full identity while within the walls of the LSE. And I think that's the institutional context that we work in. And I don't have any brilliant answers about what we do. But I think there's also a space to consider the ways in which the institution, as an institution that occupies quite a privileged and elite position within the UK context, can push. So beyond the institution to the state. So here I'm thinking, we're recording this podcast just after the UK government has introduced new restrictive regulations around student visas. I myself came here on a student visa. I'm a very privileged migrant to the UK. And I sat in home office spaces in this country next to asylum seekers who were going to have a very different, very traumatic, very painful journey through the immigration system, through the home office of this country, much more than I did when I was breezily passed through. They barely looked at my materials. My passport was checked, and off I went as a member of the Commonwealth. And that, I think, is fundamentally a space where actually an institution like LSE should be pushing, can be pushing, right, to make changes at the level of the state. And that comes to questions around immigration and student visas. It comes around questions of the cost of education in this country and what that looks like going forward. It comes when we think about bills that weaponize questions of academic freedom of speech to deny trans people in this country of their identity. We've seen that happen at this institution. And so I think there's two, at least, the two, I guess, spaces where I think we need to think about is, well, what do we do to change those institutional cultures within our walls to make a more inclusive, a more a space for students that gives them the opportunity to really take advantage of what their education has to offer and what many of the academics working here want to give. But then also, what does the institution do to the context outside of here? And to me, I think that there's a lot of work to do on both places. That's not to say it can't be done. And I want to, I guess, end to think about this, the possibility for change or hope or some optimism in all of this, because I think if we sit back and we revert to this idea of niceness, and this is something we mentioned before we started recording the podcast. This idea of, well, let's all just be nice to each other. How many times have we heard that in spaces in this institution, right? Among academic staff, among staff. Let's just be nice. Let's just try to get along, right? But actually, what that makes me think of, and when Shaku mentioned it earlier, I wanted to make sure I mentioned the work of Kate Denial, and she talks about niceness as papering over the cracks. This rhetoric of niceness in an institution, of being nice to each other, being kind, papers over the cracks of relationships, of institutional harm, and of classroom dynamics as well. And so we can't sit back and say, let's just be nice to each other and get along. And tell students, well, just be nice to each other. It's okay. Right? And that, I think, is where we have plenty of work to do, plenty of space to hopefully make change and make lasting change that, is far beyond when any of us are at this institution. And that is, I think, my hope.
Thank you, Jillian. And Michael.
I wanted to say about what we could do as individuals within LSE environment in terms of our teaching, in the way we project ourselves, the way we teach as a means of change. And of course, we operate within certain parameters. I'm still a great defender of the lecture as a format because it gives you that kind of autonomous space and interaction with the students. And I think that's an incredibly wonderful, privileged position to have that space with the students, where of course you're teaching to a syllabus. There's certain ideas you want to sort of try and teach, and certain things you have to read, and certain learning outcomes, of course, we hope to achieve at the end of the course. But I've always had this kind of intuitive. I've learned teaching, as it were. I went for my teaching certificate, and that's been very, very. I'm very pleased I did that earlier in my career. I did it at a time in my career. People say, "Hey, it's a waste of time. You should be doing research." Yeah, but I'm so pleased I spent time learning about pedagogy. Yeah, but one thing, much of it confirmed something I think I had at an intuitive level in me, which has always been, and it still remains, the idea that most effective teaching is when you're most authentic to yourself, most truthful to yourself. This is who I am. This is how and you can feed that in through, not just in terms, I'm not talking about necessarily that there are aspects of your background or life experience which might be relevant to particular topics. Sometimes there are, sometimes there aren't. But there's a particular way of dealing with people and interacting, which I think is also spills over from your interactions in everyday life. And there's a certain need, I think, there. When I looked into this in terms of the pedagogy and the literature, I kind of understood when it talks about compassionate pedagogy in terms of your ability to sort of understand, relate, empathize with people, yeah, and with people when you're teaching about things, those things are often people in my discipline, and those people have their own lives, they have their own kind of right to be represented in a certain respectful, truthful way, rather than just simply research subjects or objects. So that often there are issues even around how academic research works, although we have our own ethical structures and so forth. How we avoid, I think, what's now called extractivism in our research and even in our teaching, how we using people to advance ourselves. So I'm thinking that there's a part of that authenticity has been incredibly critically reflexive about your own practice, but also, allowing students that autonomy to develop their own kind of understanding of themselves. And as teachers, we give them the space to do that. As you say in Shaku, you may not agree with me, but I'm going to teach you to try to at least argue where you're coming from. The quality of the argumentation is something I really stress with students, the sort of the narrative that you're able to construct about something, whether it's a subject-based or even yourself. And I think when you do that, some of the things that are harmful in a pedagogic context become more apparent. Fakery is exposed. Those who are sort of selective in their interests are exposed. We can do this through research. We can do this through teaching. And even better when we're able sometimes to combine both in practice. So that practice of teaching is a kind of, and I know it sounds a bit of a cliche, when you say this is a shared journey to students. Oh yeah, sure, I'm sure you say that every year. But there is that. There's always that, because the next time you see a new group of students, there's always a particular chemistry, I'll call it, to that group of students. And you're older, well, I'm a year older, and then additional life experience. So it's always distinct. I love that kind of finding that kind of optimal kind of interaction with students, because it depends on the students. Some are shy, some not so shy. So you have to kind of, this is where the professional training is important, because you try and enable those who are shy to come out, those who may be overconfident about their ideas to maybe to question, perhaps maybe the reason they may not be so confident about those ideas, yeah? And creating that community of learning. And I think if you're doing that you could do it in other situations, of course. I mean, this is why in my discipline, experiential learning in the field, as it were, is great, because then you can interact with people out there. And so tell us about your experience. We really want to hear. And there's a certain kind of model of teaching which I think even with things like Teaching Excellence Framework, they don't pick up, for me anyway, the sort of the truth, the essence of teaching. Not surprisingly, because it's yet another league table, in a competitive kind of neoliberal university system. But I think that anything which recognises that teaching is a means by which you're enabling the students to empower themselves in some kind of, during their life path, of some kind of self-determination, self-realisation of who they are. And for me, when I was authenticity is also because research education led me want to do more of it. You get this appetite, which is really kind of addictive. I love it. Great to interact with the students. It's great to do research on this. And so any way you can try and, I think, communicate that. I think students see very quickly if a teacher's not engaged, and they quite quickly switch off. And it's kind of we have a responsibility also to entertain students in a way. It might sound quite strange, because they respond to that. And I think that's part of that authenticity. Yeah. But that's something, I don't see that in the TEF framework. Did you tell a good joke in your lecture today? And why? You might think that's a trivial example, because they don't get it. They don't get the kind of inherent humanity of teaching, the inherent sort of truthfulness about life, lived experience. And I think, how does that relate to change? I think the more we develop sort of authentic sort of living, truthful living, then the more we're able to see where things aren't going wrong, so where things aren't going right. And that kind of enables that kind of community of learning, which if it works, then the student, when they finish, carry on through life, learning as an active learner, and also thinking about society in a more decentered way. That's another key thing for me. How do you teach in a way which decenters not only yourself as a teacher, but the students? They learn to think about the other. Again, it's a challenging institution where all the norms are pushing them towards much more of an instrumental view of education. Where I need to study this and this and this to get a job here. I won't worry about the other stuff. But the other stuff is actually really important, because it's the other. It's that which you think is not valuable turns out to be quite very, very valuable. It's us. It's society. It's environment. It's community. So I think there's ways of teaching which enable change. Not to say that that we shouldn't try and also do things institutionally, but I think in terms of our teaching practice, it's actually much more powerful sometimes than we realise.
Thank you, Michael. And that notion of truth has come out really strongly here, and it reminds me of Ronaldo Walcott talking about this notion of whose truth is valid. And I actually think if we can take one thing away from today, is to push our truths forward in your research, in your teaching, and encourage our students to be truthful. And when questions of who is valid and who is human are being, we're actually having these conversations, and that's really troubling. So it's been really great having this conversation with all of you. I want to thank you so much for taking the time out, a very busy time of the year. And it's been such a learning experience for me. So I hope you felt the same as well. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I loved it. It was really great.